Diversity trainer and political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng joins us now to move the discussion forward on the racial aspects of the July 2021 unrest. Ayanda, good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. The SAHRC report says a large portion of the black population in KwaZulu-Natal, in places like Phoenix, Khan Road Corner, Verulam, Chatsworth, Montclair, were attacked and targeted because of their race, and further says it was fueled by stereotypes and misinformation disseminated by social media and a generalized notion of a swart gevaar, a danger posed by black people. How do these types of biases become so rooted and become so incendiary?
Well, I think, it all goes back to history. So we know that in South Africa, there was a hierarchy of humanity, which said that the white man was at the top, followed by the Indian man, then the colored man, and then right at the bottom, you have the black African. And so these hierarchies didn't die because apartheid and the legal system that, built this infrastructure died. And so what then happens is that you enter a post-apartheid South Africa that hasn't had a conversation about the ways in which all people of color were oppressed and all people of color were excluded from, what white people were able to get. But at the same time, you also haven't had any discussion about the ways in which the oppression that was felt was differentiated by whether you were black or you were Indian or you were colored, because there was a difference in that. And we see this also in the communities. When you look at the size of the houses, when you look at the level of schools, and if you go as far back, there's a slide that I like to use in training, particularly where we look at how much did the apartheid government spend on a white child, an Indian child, a colored child, and a black child. And you see very clearly that there was a big difference of, 100% going to a white child, about 70% going to an Indian child, 40% going to a colored child, and then 10% going to a black child. And all of this permeates where we live, how we live, the resources we're able to get, and continues to this day. Because although we are in a situation where the government in a lot of ways can be argued to be spending equally, these resources that were gathered during apartheid continue to still be held in the white community, continue to still be held in the Indian community, and continue to still be held in the colored community. That's why you'll see, for instance, that the people who have had the most mass migration into other people's neighborhoods are black people who have moved into colored communities and Indian communities and white communities, while everybody else hasn't really moved into the so-called black communities or townships.
It points to a wider social problem. You've laid down some of that groundwork, rooting it in history. But if we talk about even more contemporary history, clashes in the Indian and black communities with the 1949 and 1985 riots, also invoked by this report in Cato Manor and Inanda respectively, again supporting the notion that we have dropped the ball on social cohesion, and more importantly, a sense of justice for those who feel aggrieved or who carry the torch of their grandparents and great-grandparents' grievances. How do you correct such historical perceptions, which in some ways have become pathologized?
Well, this is exactly why at the crux of it is a danger when we don't unpack what the differentiated experience of oppression is. Because if you look at it at face value, you can say that Indians were privileged during apartheid. But then if you look at it from a different perspective, you can see that there was oppression that was experienced. And so if you don't have the nuance of understanding that it is possible to both have received some privilege and also have still at the same time been oppressed, then it's difficult to explain to people and to engage to people why we sit with the Indian versus colored versus Indian, black versus colored versus Indian situation. And of course, you've mentioned 1949, where many people lost their lives, they lost their businesses in the riots that came. And the attack at that particular point was directed by black people who also happen to be Zulu towards Indian people. And so, yes, there is the idea that this was in part a retaliation or a fear that we would get here. But how did that fear get incubated between 1949 and now? We've already spoken to this hierarchy and how it wasn't distracted. But what also we need to talk about is how WhatsApp groups in communities often point to people of color in general, if it's a white community, as being suspicious, as being potential criminals, as being loiterers, as being homeless, etc., etc. And if you go to colored communities and to Indian communities, you'll find that it's black people who are being painted with this paintbrush. And so you have a country that has inculcated into our psyche a fear of the black man and black woman, regardless of what action they take or don't take. And that's not something that's going to go away if we are not doing diversity training, if we are not teaching our children the full and correct history, all the way from the hierarchy of humanity to things like the 1949 conflict, which we've spoken about.
As you say, these intentions, the conversations, the training that you're talking about offer, one opportunity to fix what is wrong. But we also need structural support, Asanda, for this change to happen. And experts on the report are looking at the victim support bill as one mechanism that can help amongst other interventions. What do you think about that and other forms of institutional support that can credibly address this issue so that there isn't a repeat of this kind ever again in our country?
Well, I mean, I think before you can even talk about victim support, you need people's pain to be acknowledged. So the TRC started the project and then it was left incomplete. People's pain, people's histories, people's stories need to be given the space to be heard. And then secondly, you need to begin to be in a situation where when South Africans talk about their pain, regardless of which side of the race triangle they're coming from, they are listened to and they are heard, and there is engagement across race about what this is. And then secondly, you need a re-engagement with our understanding of the apartheid spatial grid. So if our government, our post-apartheid government, continues to build for black people in former black townships, build for colored people in former colored townships, and so on, then we continue the apartheid spatial grid, we continue the separations that happened during apartheid. And so you need the infrastructural shift and the breaking down or debunking, as I've written about, the apartheid spatial grid.
Yeah.
And then you need the conversations to go into the classroom. I've developed a diversity curriculum. I've been calling for the government to adopt it, or at the very least find other experts who can make sure that this is entrenched in our curriculum. Because for as long as it's not, we are going to continue to have people saying, this is the pain we experience, and have another group say, no, it wasn't that bad, you need to get over it. And then lastly, you then can start to talk about victim support. You then can start to talk about psychological support. You then can start to talk about even financial compensation for some of the losses that people experience. Because as I've said to you, in the main, for example, the white community of South Africa continues to hold on to what it had in 1994, while other communities have been dispossessed. And those who were not dispossessed through forced removals found themselves being dispossessed through gentrification. And so in Cape Town, for example,
I can't go further though, Asanda. I'm so sorry to interject you there, but you've given us a really rich architectural view of all the other work that needs to be done before we can even get to things, as you say, with the victim support bill. And I really hope that the right people are listening so that what you're talking about can be integrated and form part of that tapestry of response. Thank you for your time tonight. We appreciate it. Diversity trainer and political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng.